Hello, everybody. Madeline Hollander is joining us tonight in the afterglow of her celebrated show Sunrise Sunset at Jeffrey Deitch, which inaugurated the opening of the gallery's second Los Angeles location. Hollander is a Los Angeles native herself and is fittingly intertwined in the overlapping worlds of art and entertainment, and is perhaps best known for her choreography of the unsettling dance and movement sequences in Jordan Peele's 2019 film Us. However, an equal, if not greater achievement, her first video installation, Flatwing, appeared at the Whitney Biennial that same year. Madeline initially trained as a ballet dancer, then pursued her undergraduate studies in cultural anthropology and visual arts at Barnard College, whereafter she earned her MFA at Bard. Solo exhibitions of her work have been mounted at the Whitney, the University of Texas Austin Visual Arts Center, Bortolami Gallery, Artist Institute. Her work has been exhibited at the Brandhurst Museum in Munich, Performa Biennial in New York, the Aldrich Museum in Connecticut, Helsinki Contemporary in Finland, the Work Marathon Festival at the Serpentine Galleries, and the Centre Pompidou Metz in France. As a choreographer, Hollander's pieces have been performed at the Joyce, New York, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris, Louvre Abu Dhabi, with the Los Angeles Dance Project, Urs Fischer's immersive installation play at the Gagosian in New York, and again, Jeffrey Deitch in Los Angeles. Much of the writing around Madeline's work closely attends to the multidisciplinary nature of her interests, and for good reason. Her work since her MFA has consisted of video, sculpture, performance, installation, dance, wall text, works on paper, etc. Previous writers have noticed that she's, quote, long been fascinated by the behavior of anything that moves, whether humans, machines, or weather patterns, end quote. And while this is clearly true, it doesn't seem to me to get to the core of her practice. As a dancer, and more poignantly, a classical ballet dancer, she programmed one of the most intricate and rigorous mind-body relationships that can be achieved, and now intuitively operates from a position of fully embodied knowing. Through repetition and discipline, she sculpted herself into a vessel where mastery can meet the magical. Her artwork is a direct reflection of this embedded knowledge, and now she moves with agility and grace through whichever medium best performs her conceptual desire. And more often than not, it seems her desire is to create and illuminate the cooperation and conflicts between our complex natural systems and our increasingly complex future. I am pleased and honored to present Madeline Hollander.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank you, Kelly, for inviting me to share my work and to meet you all. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a while since I've given a talk, but I'm going to start with an overview of my work and then kind of just focus on three pieces that are formally very different from each other, but all engage with my kind of rigorous research process in a similar way. Is this good? I feel like I can't hear. Okay, great. Great. So to begin, I work with movement as my primary medium to assemble performances, installations, video, and drawings. I tend to create continuously looping events and sequences that aim to dissect and repurpose pre-existing movement systems that are actively choreographing, often invisibly, our everyday lives. Instead of developing new movements from scratch, I scan the world for existing choreographies that are already set in motion and draw inspiration from various scales. So I use the molecular, the social, and the planetary, I draw from those three scales. These can be infrastructural or institutional protocols, cultural rituals, pedestrian reflexes, tropical storm patterns, or gestures that proliferate through media or have become iconic within our socio-political landscapes. I pay close attention to the ways protocol physically sculpts our interactions, our corporeal vocabularies, our architectures, our modes of exchange, and then usually try to remap these dynamics onto different media. So I work with the human body most commonly, but also Anything that moves, like you said, or can memorize sequences also work. So for example, I've worked with cement mixing trucks, sleight of hand magicians, air conditioners, dancers, obviously, beach rake trucks. There we go. Office chairs, automobile parts, insects, and more. This is from Arena. I also work in film, like you mentioned, and collaborate with directors, animators, and stunt coordinators to develop a character's physical attributes and design signature moves that align with the overarching narratives. I'm particularly drawn to movements or choreographies that are on the brink of obsolescence. So they've just passed their threshold of cultural or technological relevance, and their original functionality is lost, but they persist because they're so deeply embedded into our nervous systems. For example, some people still use this, call me gesture, which is no longer relevant, or even the BlackBerry, or there are evacuation route posters that haven't been updated despite a building's renovation. There's installation guides that refer to outmoded electrical systems or require tools that are no longer being manufactured. These riffs are super important to me because they provide an opening to really separate or to extract the movements from their source. So you're left with a gesture or a script that can be repurposed for some other body or body part. I also love it when our autopilot behaviors lead to slapstick wake-up calls. So I'm sure everyone here has walked into someone or a wall while texting, or missed the end of one of those moving sidewalks at an airport, or experience that uncanny feeling when you step onto an escalator that's not moving. When this happens, your senses and your surroundings just very suddenly calibrate with a jolt. And it can be incredibly humorous and potentially dangerous, but this glitch is always orienting. So since 2008, I've been collecting these reflexes, gestures, postures, and adding them to a video database I call Gesture Archive, which is not much of an archive in the sense that it's horribly disorganized. It's more like a massive Dropbox, but I look to it for choreographic inspiration when composing a new piece. So it's almost like browsing through a list of ingredients. Individually specific of their site, person, or time that they are captured, collectively, this gesture archive presents a panorama of our conscious and unconscious corporeal vocabularies. The first piece that I want to talk about is called Ouroboros G's. It is a site-specific performance I created for the 2019 Whitney Biennial that brings attention to the museum's precarious location at the very edge of the Hudson River in an age of climate crisis. When making this piece, I kept thinking about how we need to recalibrate our approach to crisis protocols, emergency procedures, and environmental catastrophe when it has become increasingly clear that these categorically once-in-a-lifetime events have become part of our everyday forecasts. For example, the once labeled 100-year storm has officially been demoted to a 5-year storm, and it's only a matter of time before those storms really normalize to become annual or even monthly events. So for this piece, I collaborated with the Whitney facilities staff, art handlers, and dancers to choreograph the deployment and dismantling of the Whitney's flood mitigation system that circumnavigates the museum. It's a massive 16-foot steel and aluminum vapor-tight flood barrier wall that protects the building from significant flood damage and blocks small boats and trucks that might float into its facade in the case of a flood. This barrier system, which was developed out of necessity after Hurricane Sandy, turned the Whitney's construction zone into a massive bathtub in 2012, has always been kept out of the public eye. The drills and deployments only occur at night or on days that the museum is closed, so this performance became its public debut. So I want to share the story behind this work because I feel like its circuitous path that led me to actually develop this performance is pretty representative of the path that most of my pieces go through in order to finally take shape. So the origin story begins with my very long time fascination with an originless game called tug of war, which I think most people know or are familiar with. Did that? Oh no, that's more of the flood. Well, there we go. Despite its ubiquity across cultures, the game lacks any real history. No one really knows where this game came from. There's evidence that this sport was practiced in Egypt, in Myanmar, in New Guinea, in China, and it reappears in folk tales and mythologies and drawings and artifacts found around the world. During the Tang Dynasty, there are records of really large-scale tug-of-war events with ropes that would extend over 500 feet, with these shorter extension ropes coming out of it, kind of like a centipede, and it was composed of over 500 players. In ancient Greece, the sport was called Halkustindia. I can't pronounce it. Halkustinda, which had 3 varieties. 2 were played with a rope and 1 without, where the players linked arms and hands to create an interlocking chain link of human limbs. There are legends depicting the sun and the moon playing tug-of-war over light and darkness, and the moon and the ocean playing tug-of-war over the tides. Let's go back. So this game takes many forms, but the common rule which runs consistently throughout every iteration, both ancient and contemporary, is the requirement of having equal mass on either side of the rope. This means that there can be an unequal number of players on each team, as long as their opposing weight zeroes out. This also means that the players need to have the equivalent frictional relationship to the ground and the rope, so they all have to wear the same shoes or gloves or none at all. Also, from 1900 to 1920, tug-of-war was actually part of the Olympic Games, and it was the only sport, I think still, where athletes from other disciplines could compose the 2 teams of each players on either side of the rope. So these teams were determined by weight, not their nationality. So here's this incredible instant where a universal constant, gravity, overrides the fundamental ideology of the Olympic Games, which is the pride of one's national identity. But not surprisingly, this sport, there we go. This sport did not last long in the Olympics. Okay, now we're going to jump back to the Whitney. After being invited to the Biennial, I spent a lot of time just walking around the building and exploring the site. The building is this Renzo piano structure, which is literally on top of the Hudson, and happens to look a lot like a ship. Every time I visited the museum, I found myself way more interested in the activity around the Hudson River, and it kind of hit me how little I actually knew about this massive body of water, its history, the cultures that it inhabits or generates both inside the water and out. And this is despite having lived next to it for practically 15 years. So I decided that the river was going to be my stage, and the tugboats, who are truly the rulers of the Hudson, were going to be my performers. My proposal was to present a game of tug-of-war performed by 2 opposing tugboats. The Hudson would be the arena. The stairs leading up to the museum would be the bleachers, or actually, there's a theater inside that I was hoping to use as well. And the tugboats would be the players, and their captains would be the choreographers. I was also excited about the idea that it could be viewed from both sides of the river at once. So from the Whitney on the West Side Highway, or Sinatra Park, which is located directly across the river in New Jersey. There we go. So I began speaking with every tugboat company, and I spoke with captains and Coast Guards and boat engineers, and spent a lot of time at the South Street Seaport Museum working with the director of historic ships to just soak up as much information as possible about their very beautiful resident tug called the W.D. Decker, which is parked in front of the museum and was going to participate as one of the performers in this duet. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the Hudson. Yeah. So these field trips very quickly unveiled how complex the Hudson River actually is, and that it's a very particular tidal estuary. I had no idea that there were 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day, and that the river flowed both ways, north up to the Adirondacks and south to the Atlantic, and is composed of both fresh water and ocean water that are mixed by the winds and the tides. The Hudson isn't even its original name. The Mohicans, a native tribe that settled along the river, called it Mahicanatuk, which I also can't pronounce, but it translates to the river that flows both ways, or the waters that are never still. So of course the tugboat's captains knew everything there is to know about these waters and its shifting currents, and they took a lot of pride in their, oh, sorry, that was mine. In being like the tugboats being these ultimate maneuverers of the harbor. Each company had their own heroic tales depicting mission impossible, like rescues dating back to the turn of the century, or recent catastrophes like 9/11. Hold on, let's see. Here's some, yeah. Some more recent catastrophes like 9/11, the Scully plane crash, and Sandy. After these conversations, it became pretty clear that the river is literally performing a game of tug of war 24/7. The Atlantic and the Adirondacks are the opposing teams, but the moon and the sun were really in charge. They were the captains. And if you happen to be at the Hudson sometime, you should look across and you can see that there's actually these, they're almost like freeway lanes, and you can see that one part of the river will be going up while the other's going down, and you can see visually these 2 currents going in opposing directions. So one of the captains that I spoke to, told me the story of their company's adventures during Sandy, and how their tugs were really responsible for removing debris, delivering first aid and food, and herding all the untethered boats and bobbing cars from the West Side Highway. He also described the extent of the damage along the West Side Highway, specifically around the site of the Whitney Museum. In 2012, when Sandy hit, the Whitney was still an exposed construction site, and 6.5 billion tons of water filled its foundational hole. So all the equipment that was placed in what was going to become their basement just bobbed up to the top of this pool. And it was this haunting image that turned my interest back to the site of the Whitney. And I went to the curator, Chrissy Isles, who was there to witness all of this, to just learn more about what happened and what her experience was. And she started showing me these images of this flood mitigation system. There we go. Here's when they were developing it. So it's an advanced lock and log, vapor-tight, mobile structure made of steel and aluminum beams and columns that click together to form a temporary wall around the building. And though essential to the safety of the building, this highly sophisticated structure is never seen. Excuse me. So this also explained these mysterious there's these silver caps that were studying the sidewalks in front of the building that I was just kind of intrigued by. And underneath each cap is a very large bolt used for locking the vertical posts into the concrete. There we go. The rest of the floodgate material, hundreds of aluminum logs and unique toolkits, all were stored on the second floor of a former meatpacking building just north of the museum. So I got to tour this building as well. You couldn't even walk through it. It was just kind of floor to ceiling piles of these beams. So I got really into the technical details around this system and the design and development of how it came about and who was involved. But I will try to just focus on a few relevant points here. So the original design by architect Renzo Piano was in collaboration with Roberts and Cooper, and their original flood mitigation wall was checked off all of FEMA's 500-year flood regulation requirements. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency that you kind of have to get signed off by in order to do anything. And they even added an extra foot for security, but this clearly failed. Also, Hurricane Sandy was considered a superstorm, which was a very new term at the time that still doesn't have a solid definition. And I just learned that a storm will earn its super prefix when it incurs billions of dollars of economic damage, and it has nothing to do with its size or type. Yeah, this is it. So after Sandy, here we go, it was clear FEMA was not a reliable resource for directing the Whitney on how to build a flood-resistant building. So the Whitney's director, Adam Weinberg, brought in engineering consultants from Hamburg, Venice, and the Netherlands that specialize in building buildings designed to withstand seasonal flooding as a norm. They were brought in, they just reassessed the site, and their plan was to lay out a new plan for rebuilding. Apparently, the firms all came back advising a 16.5-foot elevation protection barrier. This is 7.5 feet higher than FEMA's original guidance. The Whitney then hired Walls and Krenzer, a manufacturer that specializes in watertight doors for naval vessels, not buildings, to develop a site-specific system that could be deployed by anyone, not just the facility staff or contractors, but by the art handlers, the general public, or anyone at hand. I also learned from the former chief of officer, the former chief operating officer, that this exoskeleton is just one of many elements that compose an extremely sophisticated network that runs throughout the building, so that it's designed to withstand extreme flooding, not just to block it out. For example, in the case that the water levels go over this barrier system, the museum staff would be directed to just open up the big glass doors into the lobby so that the water just flows freely into the building without resistance. So that would mean that the entire lobby would fill up like a fish tank. And when this happens, though counterintuitive, the water actually serves as a foundation, providing more structural stability than the upper floors. There are these huge cross beams in the lobby. So yeah, everything there that's gray is designed to fill up like a fish tank. And there's these cross beams that are holding up the rest of the building and are designed to withstand this. And because of this underwater safety feature, the exhibition galleries and museum collection starts on the fifth floor and moves up, placing them 71 feet above the Hudson. So any artwork that's installed in the lobby needs to be able to be deinstalled in under 30 minutes. And there are separate insurance policies for the artworks stored below and above the fifth floor. So at this point, I was hooked by this hidden barrier, and I really wanted to find a way to use the Biennial as a platform to make it visible. I was also really shocked to learn that there was no instruction manual. This is all that they had. Or any description of roles for a project of this scale, and had learned that the drills had proved to be pretty chaotic and exhausting events. Each beam does have a sticker that is one of these that just indicates where it belongs, but no info on how to slide and click it in, or the order of operations required to safely assemble the barrier system. Those who had previous experience, those who had previous experience with the drills were entirely responsible for instructing the new workers how to do everything, just from memory, which isn't a casual task. They're assembling essentially a 500-foot long sculpture composed of thousands of 80-pound beams, which require at least 2 people to lift. Not to mention whatever the challenges of doing this when there's anxiety and panic that might arise because of actually anticipating a storm. So my tugboat proposal was put on hold, and I proposed a performance that would convert these annual deployment drills into a deliberate and celebratory choreography for the public to witness. these are some sketches while I was trying to figure out how we were going to do this. And the other aspect of it was it would be free to the public. There wouldn't be an entrance fee to see this performance. The proposal was problematic on many fronts, mainly because it calls attention to the overwhelming precarity and proximity of the museum to the river, and the glaring fact that none of the neighboring buildings have anything like this multi-million-dollar shield that has been deemed crucial for all buildings in that flood zone. So ideally, I wanted the team to be able to re-perform the rehearsed sequences designed to streamline each phase of the installation every year for the drill. I wanted the performance documentation to serve as a video tutorial that could be passed to new museum staff, and I would create its first illustrated instruction manual, notating the more nuanced maneuvers and techniques. This new proposal was accepted and canceled and re-accepted and re-canceled and kept toggling back and forth like this up until days before the performance, creating another tug of war between myself and the institution, also between the board and the curators and the facilities staff and the art handlers, which only now in retrospect feels incredibly appropriate and even part of the piece as a whole, but at the time it was pretty excruciating. Okay, so finally, thanks to the, I'm not sure why this keeps pausing, stuck. Yeah. So I was given the go-ahead, thanks to the curators, to deploy a large portion of the wall, so 6 segments. However, my request to have it aligned with the annual drill was never really acknowledged. I worked closely with the director of facilities and 7 dancers to develop a choreography that would continuously install and deinstall the barrier system, creating this repeating and rippling assembly line that would recycle the top beam from the last segment and bring it to the first beam of the new segment. So it's hard to, I call it a leapfrog pattern, but it was essentially like we took these 6 segments that were closer to the high line and we kind of one by one leapfrogged, or almost like what a slinky does downstairs, moved them all the way around the building. So the whole process was really a demonstration of these techniques and getting them in our bodies. So this is also how the title Ouroboros cheese came about. Ouroboros being the symbol of the snake eating its own tail. And the beams that we were working with all happened to be labeled G, so that's where that came from. But Ouroboros, like tug of war, has shown up across cultures and taken various forms since ancient times, and it represents an eternal cyclic renewal and infinity. And it's perpetually striving towards a state of equilibrium. So for me, this related to the looping pattern of the choreography, but also the cyclical motion of the tides and the inevitable return of the superstorms and even the biennial. The choreography accomplished really specific technical functions, such as rubber gasket testing or bolt cap cleaning, and at the same time created ergonomic flow. The moves were simultaneously utilitarian and expressive, and through repetition, they became waltz-like and meditative without giving up their functional integrity. So for example, we workshopped with each of the tools to understand all the ways you can hold it, pass it, use it, like how you would transfer it from one hand to another, how you'd pass it to someone else. And we would count how many spins of the bolt was actually needed before it would click into the concrete. We tested whether techniques would move faster if we used our elbows or feet or heads. Let's see if I have any image of that. There we go. And memorize these step together rhythms that made passing beams less backbreaking. We set starting positions and finishing positions, formations of loading and unloading the crates, and established tricks for collectively keeping time and flow throughout the production. One of our biggest feats was figuring out this maneuver we call parallel parking. There we go. Which was this zigzagging motion, or almost like a sawing action, of the beam that would go between two people and then eventually in between the two beams, that would orient the beam in the exact angle it needed to be in order to slide down between the posts. The specificity of how these beams needed to be aligned in order to slide them into place without jamming was truly beyond anyone's expectations. And all of these techniques were new to the staff as well, and significantly sped up the process because it established a routine and a rhythm. So after the sun went down, these are more pictures of us during the performance. There was this moment where we just kind of entered a trance-like state. We had been synchronized for so long that we had no idea how fast or slow we were moving. And since then, I've been told that the drills, their annual deployment, have become more streamlined. The choreographies and techniques we developed as a team for the performance proved to be more efficient and less backbreaking than previous techniques, or there were no techniques, and set up a rhythmic order to the deployment process that had never been established. So unofficially, it did become integrated into the annual drills. And then let's see. Here's a short clip from the Whitney that just gives a sense of the motion. And this is one of the vapor-tight vessel, naval vessel doors. Next one. All right. The last component of this piece is a sculptural element, which I call nose cone. It's two segments of the barrier at the southwest corner that was installed for the duration of the exhibition. I chose this point because if the Hudson were to flood, it'd be the first point of contact where the water hits the site, and served as a billboard of sorts for the upcoming performance that was in the fall. I had hoped this piece would remain up indefinitely, which would have given the staff a huge leg up for future deployments, but this request was also denied. I'm not sure if this unveiling was threatening, exposing the museum's vulnerable location and the fact of rising sea levels, or whether it was more a question of whether this piece could be considered a work of art, or what that means, or what it would mean if it were to enter the collection. So amusingly, this piece generated a lot of confusion. It was unclear whether it was authored by me or the museum or the engineers, whether it was an artwork, whether it could withstand being outside and be exposed to the elements, which some people were really worried about, despite it being designed to withstand rain and salt water and anything. And the day before the opening, I noticed that, it was covered in caution tape because suddenly it was deemed a potential hazard. And I understood their concerns, but I asked if they could just swap the cones with the customary stanchion posts that were used for all the other outdoor works or any sculpture in the exhibition. There was no answer, but instead they decided to bring in a permanent guard. Do I have a picture? No, I don't have a picture of the guard. To literally guard the barrier, which was literally guarding the museum, which for me added another level of performativity that I wasn't expecting. Oops, that's the next one. Yeah. So before I go to the next piece, if anyone has any questions about this work, we can stop now. Or everyone's welcome to just
How long was
interrupt.
the performance?
It was about 4 hours.
And how many panels did you put up?
So it was 6 panels, not 6 panels, like 6 segments, which was the minimum number of segments that would qualify it for a drill. I had asked to do the entire, really, do the entire thing, and that was completely shut down. I mean, which is understandable because no one would be able to enter or exit the museum. And so that was kind of the balancing point that we were able to do. And that's why we had decided to kind of perform the installation and dismantling, moving those 6 segments from one end all the way to the other end. So we essentially, did the installation for the entire piece, but we didn't leave them. We took the last one, moved it over, took the last one.
What do you mean about the leave?
Yeah, I can't figure out how to.
Now I got it.
Yeah.
So that's why it was 4
So
hours.
we installed
because
the
you-
entire system,
6 by 6,
6 by 6 segments.
one
Yeah,
at a time. I see.
exactly.
You
It was
walked-
pretty exhausting.
So you basically circumvented the museum by flipping.
Exactly. So once the 6th one was up, we'd go back to the first one and we'd take all of those beams and put them on to connect to the 7th, and then
Interesting.
we did that little
Now I get it. I didn't understand that.
leapfrog. Yeah.
4 hours. And how long would the drill be if it was just a normal, like,
It would take all day. To put up this piece before
No,
we
if-
had done any of the choreography, it took like 8 hours because no one remembered how to do it.
no, but if they do have a, like,
It could be 16 hours. Like it was just, it's total chaos. Not anymore, but it was at this time, they really were, the staff kept on having turnover. There was no one who had experience doing it. They put up this piece about 4 times before they actually got it right.
they don't really know how long it would take in case of an emergency, right?
They don't know, either they allow for a whole day or more, but they really do have a lot of warning usually when a superstorm is coming.
Interesting.
So, but yeah, the drills are, they've been streamlined since.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go on to the next.
Oh, sorry.
You mentioned a couple times that the museum was sort of institutionally afraid of people knowing about this wall and that making them seem vulnerable somehow. Did they say anything more specific about that? To me, it seems like a kind of ostentatious show of power to have this
Exactly.
incredible engineered system from Europe protecting it. So I was surprised that they see it as like a vulnerable position.
Yeah, I was very surprised, and I also felt the same way, and I thought it would be something that would be really encouraged to bring out into the public, but I think that there was a huge split, kind of a perfect split in the board. So Adam Weinberg, who really, got behind this and brought in all these experts to kind of get into, what is this sculpture that's for the Whitney, and what, how can we, it took pride in it, was on one side, and then there was the side that was a little bit more conservative. This is, they had just moved from the Breuer building, and the proximity. I mean, it's just so close, and so it requires kind of taking into account the fact that this is going to happen repeatedly. So I think, I think that's something that we all need to just embrace and get behind, which is why I wanted this to, I think that this should go up every month. It should be something that should just like a social dance, or it should be a party, and you can just volunteer to just do it and put on music or something. But, because that's the frequency that these things are going to happen. And then obviously, eventually, all of Manhattan's going to be underwater. But, until then, all these protocols just have to become, I think it's, this has to be shared. This has to be the reality. So, the back and forth it was never really articulated to me. It was just kind of implied that, accepted, like canceled because someone wasn't happy with this idea, accepted, canceled, or you can use, one segment, or you can use the toolkit. Like it kind of went back and forth in terms of what scale they would be comfortable with.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you as an artist works in a situation like that, like how you prepare for that kind of flexibility of having access to certain components of this and then not, and just that process in general.
Yeah, I think that in a way that's what these three pieces are really about, is this inevitable like evolution and mutation of every single one of my pieces, and really kind of being certain that this is the proposal, here's what I'm going to do, and then the second I dive into the research, the whole thing somersaults. And it leads me to be connected with people so that the piece ends up being a very real collaboration. So I'm no longer this, I have this idea and I sketched it out and this is my choreography. It's very much developed and choreographed, and a collective effort for this to happen. So and that's really been the case with every one of my pieces. Is I have an idea, it gets kind of blown apart, and then it slowly goes through a lot of chaos and it potentially not happening up until the week of, and then something clicks because of this collective effort, and then it becomes the thing that I had been kind of reaching for, which I usually don't understand until after the fact, but yeah. I'm starting to get used to that, I guess. There we go. I'm going to play this video and talk about this piece at the same time. Okay. So this is a piece called New Max. It's a performance installation from 2018 that took place at the Artists Institute, that creates a dynamic network system featuring 4 air conditioner units, 4 dancers, and 4 temperature sensors, and the lights, and mimics the patterns of rising global temperatures. New Max is composed of movement sequences that are designed specifically to raise the gallery's internal temperature through the performer's body heat. The performance begins when the gallery opens at 10, and the thermostat is set to 65 degrees, which is the environmental standard that art institutions use for storing and displaying works of art, to prevent them from growing mold or warping. And the dancers repeat their sequences over and over until the temperature is raised 5 degrees, so until it hits 70 degrees, at which point the lights turn off, the ACs blast on, and the dancers lie down, which we'll see in a moment, and they rest until the temperature goes back down to 66 degrees, 1 degree higher than the previous starting temperature, and the cycle begins again. So the lights would turn on, the ACs turn off, and the dancers resume their rigorous movement sequences from the moment they left off until the temperature rises 5 more degrees, so 71, and then this pattern continues on loop for the whole day, with each maximum temperature hitting 1 degree higher than the previous cycle, which I called the zip tie effect, which in a way also relates to Ouroboros, now that I think about it. I made this piece when I was particularly overwhelmed by new data sets showing a steady incremental increase in average low and high temperatures across the globe. And the reality that these average lows were creeping up in parallel with the corresponding highs just emanated this feeling of the frog boiling in water, or the fact that this, what is considered average can be digested as normal when it is so far from it. So that was just this is their cooling cycle. So the cooling cycle could take anywhere from 5 minutes to 20 minutes to an hour, depending on how hot it was outside, how many people were in the room. A million factors. And same with the heating cycles. When we started at 10 a.m., it was usually pretty cold, or we started in the winter and the exhibition continued through the spring. So it would take us hours to get to 5 degrees warmer. And then in the springtime, it was like in 5 minutes, we could get 5 degrees warmer. Another factor which I really enjoyed was, here we have like 15 people in the gallery. So this meant that it would take us usually half the time to get to 5 degrees warmer, because on average, when you're sitting, you're emanating 100 watts, and just the body heat of the audience would significantly give us a leg up. Also, when we found that we would rest because we've hit our max temperature and the lights would go off, a lot of people would think that this was the end of the performance, so everyone would leave, and then all of a sudden it would get really cold. So the second they'd leave, it would drop 5 degrees, and then we'd be up dancing again, and no one would be in the gallery. So it was really interesting over months of time. It was a very long run to really begin to learn and expect how long it would take to kind of move up and down 5 degrees. And the choreography for these heating movement sequences were inspired by warm-up routines of all different types. So I would just kind of Google like the 5-minute warm-up, like core warm-up on YouTube, and pull out a bunch of moves there, like burpees and weird Pilates movements. I also looked at hurricane trajectories and tropical storm patterns, frostbite prevention techniques, like certain sport warm-up methods. I think there's this is a boxing routine. Movement patterns of molecules undergoing fusion or microwave, windmills and other energy harnessing technologies. And then when you kind of suture all these together to create sequences, it really did create a sweaty results. Keep going.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So does someone sit out so everyone kind of gets a break at some point? You guys cycle through the dancers. Is that you sitting?
That's me sitting out there.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to have 5 in case someone wanted to rest.
Got it.
Usually that didn't happen. Sometimes one person couldn't make it because this was happening every weekend, or maybe twice a week, I think. And I just wanted to have the dancers feel that if they needed to sit out, there was
They
not
could,
an issue.
and you could jump in. Got it.
Madeline, what's that paper, this thing?
The on the ground.
Oh, people holding
Oh, there we go. Wait, these
Oh,
are some
okay.
drawings.
Oh.
I'll go back to these, but the paper. I'll go back to this. This is the press release. So A.E. Benenson wrote this incredible essay, which is titled "That Test Pattern Using a Thermal Printer." So it's a receipt machines just use a thermal printing technique. So everything in the performance is about heat. And then we also, you can't run an air conditioner without having a place for its exhaust. So there was another small room in the Artists Institute, which became the exhaust room, which was really disgusting because you can imagine it was just this would be so not okay during COVID. But it was very humid and kind of smelly, and it felt like a really funky sauna. But it was cool to, then you walk into the other space and it felt like a museum. And you just kind of understand that every time you walk into a museum or a space that has air conditioner, there is the other side, and that's usually pouring into our atmosphere. But in this case, you got to bathe in it. And then, so I also use sandbags to kind of delineate the stage. And there's the kind of plastic, like walk-in refrigerator panels so that it was temperature controlled in the gallery. So this piece and all of my pieces also usually come hand in hand with a series of drawings. These were also displayed in another part of the gallery. And these were just me kind of going through the movement sequence, the heating sequences for the choreography. Here's some of them.
How many exercises?
Sorry?
How many exercises?
There were 10 sequences, but each of the sequences kind of Frankenstein together maybe 50 different sources of movements that I was pulling together, from molecules and weather patterns and for warm-ups.
Run through the game.
Yeah, so it was 10 sequences, and then we just loop it. And of course, the sequences, evolved and mutated over time. Which, so looking at a video from day 1 to after 3 months of this, it was almost entirely new choreography. Oh yeah, and so the press release was also, there was just a receipt printer sitting on the desk, so you just hit the button and it would print out for you when you enter the space. Then review. I'm gonna let this play. So, anyone have any other thoughts about?
I wanted to ask you, how do you design the costumes or like what they wear? Like, how are those choices made?
That's usually the hardest part for
Yeah.
me because I'm never thinking about, I'm only really thinking about the movement, and it's kind of like my blind spot. For New Max, I wanted them to feel like a team. And there was these, 4 very sterile looking air conditioner units, and I decided to use boxing shorts and kind of just be like, okay, this is a boxing team, and use that, and these mesh tops are very breathable. So it's a kind of trying to fuse one aspect of the concept with something that's very functional. For Ouroboros, we had to wear what you actually have to wear for the actual drill, which is the hard hat, the knee pads, everything,
Yeah.
closed-toed shoes, and then my decision was we're all going to wear black or just kind of streamline, like, make it uniform in some way. And then this piece, I collaborated with an artist, Anna Sophie Berger, to develop costumes, and she's done the costumes for several pieces of mine. Let this play. So this is called Review. It is a performance that I created for the Performa Biennial in 2021. And it features 25 dancers. It takes place in the Max Fish swimming pool in the Lower East Side of New York. This is a very New York heavy presentation. And this piece also went through a very transformative process to get to where it landed. So there's 25 dancers, and they're each representative of different companies in New York. So we have Alvin Ailey, Bill T. Jones, Martha Graham, American Ballet Theater, New York City Ballet. It was I was trying to take these little samples from these very iconic companies from all over. And the piece began actually as something called Preview. And the idea and my proposal was to work with dancers from all these different companies. And I asked them, what are you preparing for the fall? And that was going to be a premiere, and wanted all of them to just join, to kind of share the same stage and present a version, like a rehearsed or a marking version of their piece in this, like, right before all these pieces were going to premiere, to kind of offer this preview of what's going to happen in City Center in all these different stages at BAM, and kind of, for the first time bring together these companies and these dancers who have never shared a stage, and kind of have it be a very exciting look into what's happening and what's about to appear. But that timing actually aligned with COVID. So by the time that was supposed to happen, COVID hit, everything was shut down, and everything was put on hold. We had no idea it was going to last. Still lasting, still going. But a year after this, after it being delayed, I still had a relationship with the dancers I was working with and had begun rehearsing with, and they were still waiting to see whether or not their performances were going to ever happen, and they weren't rehearsing, and they were really upset about not being able to practice. And I realized that this piece, if it was going to happen, was not going to be about this premiere. It was going to be taking all the pieces that were canceled during the pandemic or indefinitely postponed, and creating this kind of homage to all of the dancers who, weren't able to do either their last performance, before they retired because, that performance was canceled, or their first debut on Broadway. There was a lot of, it was really hard. So we have, the whole thing kind of got inverted to become Review, and I decided to work with a lot of the same dancers I'd begun working with, but also new dancers. And I asked them, what are the pieces that were scheduled for the entire period of the pandemic. So we got a lot of material in here. And we had, this is Fiddler on the Roof. We have Anna Teresa DeKeer's Maker's West Side Story, which I think it had done its like press preview and then was shut down. We have Martha Graham pieces. We have the Nutcracker. We have all kind of everything. I went to the companies and asked for their program and their scheduled events and kind of went through and was like, okay, these are the ones that had premiered. Here are the ones that are never going to happen again. And how can we bring together these dancers to kind of almost exercise this choreography that they had been rehearsing for so long, out. This rehearsal process was extremely complicated because all of a sudden I brought in dancers from all these different companies who each had choreographies that I could never correct. It was these ready-made choreographies. It was entire ballets, solos, variations, and I kind of just like, okay, go. And immediately it was this total, it was just collisions and everyone's trying to, it didn't work out at all. So much of this process was not choreography. It was kind of puzzle piecing all of these works together and understanding each of their trajectories, and also deciding which dancers from which companies are going to have different fronts so that they can perform their piece in full without colliding with each other. So it started with working with really small groups and then adding in kind of one company at a time to see where these collision points were. But it was really fascinating to have no understanding of what the choreography was, except for certain roles that I did in my ballet career. And just kind of watch them pour out of the dancers. The other aspect of this was it begins with all of them marking their sequences. So marking is this kind of fascinating universal dance language where if anyone has danced or grew up dancing or doing ballet, there's a sign language that kind of represent each gesture represents a different movement in ballet or in dance. So you can travel anywhere in the world and take a ballet class and just watch the instructor and not be able to speak the language and know exactly what's going on. Or this is why, a 98-year-old can teach a ballet class and sit down and just do everything with their hands, and everyone knows what they're talking about. And this language is something that dancers usually don't understand that they're fluent in because you learn it via osmosis. You just do it unconsciously, and then it's something that when you're about to perform or you're in the wings, you often are going through the steps of your variation or your part to kind of prime your brain before you jump on stage. So it's this very kind of intimate, it's something to communicate with, but it's also something that you do very intimately. And it's something that, whether or not you're a ballet dancer or a contemporary dancer, it really does share a linguistic form. So there's 3 acts to review, and in each of the acts, each company is doing 3 different works that were canceled. And in the first moment of each of the acts, they're going through the choreography in the marked version, which this piece was 1 hour and 15 minutes. I don't think I can scrub forward and backwards yet, but we will see. So you see them doing these very kind of small movements, but they're like their hands represent their feet, their arms, their head, and it's very intricate. And then the next round, they do it where they're actually blocking the movement. So they're using their hands, but they're imagining their stage, whether or not it's BAM or the joist or whatever it is, and moving the full trajectory. And then the third version is them just kind of releasing the choreography and getting it out. one of the things that I realized in rehearsing was that the moment that this piece started to become successful is when I could start to see, if you just kind of like zoom in on one of the dancers, you could begin to see their entire world on the stage. You could imagine what costume they were wearing. You could see, because they would do things with a cape, or like you could see the gestures. You would understand what their props were. You would understand their type of theater based off of the way that they were projecting. And it was like kind of getting this window into, or they would literally project their entire theater and that experience of, whether it was the Nutcracker or the, the sets for West Side Story just kind of became visible, which was really magical. The swimming pool was, I chose this as the site because it was bigger than any of the stages that they had ever danced on, so it meant that all of these stages could fit within it. And it was also sunken, and for me, this piece was also kind of an epitaph for all of these performances and choreographies that may never actually hit the stage. So there is definitely a somber aspect to this. My sister, Celia Hollander, a composer and artist, did the score. And the score is synced with these work lights. So every time one of the dancers would go onto stage to begin their piece, they turn on their work light. That would be synced with the track, and it would create these different chords. And so each act had a different chord. And then as they turned off their light when they finished their piece, that tone would go off. So it went from 25 notes, 1 to 25 notes, from 25 to 1 notes for each act. And the costumes are by Anna Sophie Berger. And again, I really wanted something to unify the dancers when they're, to represent their company. But I wanted the whole thing to be pedestrian and visible. And this is what she came up with. And so you like everyone who's in the dark blue is New York City Ballet. We have Limon in the orange. And you can kind of start to follow along, even if they're at different parts of the stage dancing with each other. It's easier to follow them. This piece was both humorous and emotional. The dancers were also singing a lot of time, or humming their melody to kind of, because that's just what you do when you have the music. And so that was also audible, or like singing the lines if it was a Broadway show. So you kind of got this cacophony of this chord. Here's an example of, the duration of each of these pieces were totally different as well. So we had, a 30-minute variation, we had a 2-minute solo, we had all these, every movement was a completely different performance.
How interesting that the solo would be almost in the dark because of only one light.
Yeah.
Was that intentional or?
No, this is also a piece that we weren't able to rehearse on the site until the day of the performance. So it was very live. It was live streamed.
But I think it goes along with what you're describing about.
Yeah.
There's a sorrow or it's almost something, it's a ghost of a performance.
Exactly. It was very ghostly. And this is also the only performance, I think, where I received letters from every single one of the dancers afterwards, talking about their experience with that particular choreography. And for most of them, this was the first time that they had performed since the pandemic. And these were pieces that they were, anticipating performing and very excited about. So this was a kind of, it was very moving for everybody. And that was also something we did not expect. I thought it was going to be a much more chaotic and kind of slapstick piece. And the event proved to be just about this time, and kind of reflecting on also how difficult the pandemic is on dancers specifically, who need space, who need to be able to breathe freely, and who, it's very hard to be a professional dancer remotely. You can do so much in your kitchen and
Or the
yeah.
bathroom.
or bathroom, or living room, or outside. And so much of being a performer is having an audience. And so this was the first time that there was an audience as well. The other part of this piece was when everyone was entering, like 30 minutes before the performance started. I was also talking to ushers and people at the theater about their experience, having their jobs be shut down for so long and really not knowing when the theaters are going to open up again, and that really missing that feeling of anticipation before a curtain goes up, and how we kind of conjure that emotion. And so I asked ushers from various theaters who are representing pieces from this work, or in this work, to bring I'm forgetting the word, the bells, or like the little chimes that you hear right before a performance or after an intermission that go like ding, 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 ding. And there's like a signature sound for each theater. So sometimes it's a bell, sometimes it's a little xylophone, sometimes it's a triangle. So I had the ushers just walking around the pool, playing their tones kind of all at once at the intervals or the pattern that they are used to doing for their particular theater. And this was all happening as everyone was taking their seats. And then when they stopped, the lights went off and the performance began. So yeah, that's review. I went through 3 pieces, yeah.
I'm curious about your relationship with all the dance artists that you work with. I actually saw the live stream of this.
Oh, wow.
For the premiere. It was really amazing, from here in LA. But you work with a lot of different dancers, and I think, usually you see choreographers who are working with a particular group of dancers over time. And like from my perspective, listening to the talk, like, do you see that relationship between the dancer and you as a choreographer, you as an artist, as the thing, or one component to the thing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think because my work is so site specific, usually, and I'm working with things like, that are inanimate as well. My relationship is more to movement and less so to dancers. But, so, I needed to work with these dancers in order to make this piece. It was the only way. But there is a handful, like there's 7 dancers that I've been working with continuously or for over a decade that are, they were all in the Whitney piece. They're also in the New Max piece. And for me, we just all speak the same language. So I'll often work with them, even if I'm doing a piece somewhere else, like in Europe, I'll rehearse with them because we just communicate so well and they really understand the aesthetic and the goal and like how I work. And it's really collaborative. And then I'll take those sequences, I'll just videotape the rehearsals and then go to wherever I am. And, whether I'm working with sanitation department or dancers in another country or working with mocap and, actors, I'll just take that choreography that I developed with them and just map it onto this new form. So for me, they're like family and they're essential to this process. But I would say more often than not, I'm just kind of doing an archaeology, like a dig at the site for who's going to be the performer, whether or not I'm going to be using a vehicle or, who's going to be moving in the piece. Yeah.
More like a curiosity. There's every once in a while there are people running around. Like what are they doing?
Yeah, so there were a lot of rules in this piece because, like I said, we start one act, and there's one piece that's 3 minutes, another piece that's 15 minutes, another one that's 14 minutes. So each act, each dancer performed their piece 3 times, unless it was over 30 minutes, their work. So the first time they performed it, it was the small marking, internal kind of going through the choreography. After they finished that, they would exit, do a lap around the pool, and then re-enter and do the version where they're walking out the entire trajectory while marking. So like one step bigger. Once they finish that, they do their bow, and then they do a lap around the pool, and then they re-enter and they do their largest version. So this was a way so that you weren't immediately going from 25 dancers down to 5 in 5 minutes. And also kind of served as a warm-up for them because it was pretty cold that night, so everyone ended up really enjoying the jog. And then I guess the entrances and exits were another part of this that were really interesting. It was every type style of dance, or every ballet actually, or every dance has a very, the entrance and exit and bow is also choreographed. So the way that you go from the wings onto stage or exit is part of your character or is part of that choreography. So I had everyone do those entrances and exits full out the entire time. And at the end, I wonder if I can skip to the end. That's okay. At the end, all of them perform all of their bows at once to every side of the pool. So they did their bows all together, and you would see how the Martha Graham Company does a bow versus how Sydney Ballet does a bow versus Limon versus Big Dance Company. And they did it 4 times to each direction. Yeah, thank you. If there's other questions, yeah.
Sorry, I have
No
another
worries.
question. Could you maybe speak to the being able to work cross-industry between all the different mediums? In your intro, whoever gave your intro, it just struck me that you're like the genre is just, there's no limit to that. It's like whatever conceptual desire you have, wherever it fits, it can go there. But there's so many boundaries, if you will, just between industry. Can you maybe just speak to how you work between them all and sort of are transient to each?
Yeah, for me, they really feed each other, but they are really different worlds, and they have really different rules and contracts. And working in film, or to be a movement consultant in a film, for example, I'm collaborating with the director, the cinematographer, the stunt coordinator, and the actors to develop. I'm essentially making movement notes for the whole script. So finding ways to take the character and the story and kind of merge their physicality so that it actually aligns and isn't, taking a character who really understanding the character's history and training and background, so that not pulling out these moves that have nothing to do with the story, or their, the integrity is lost. And then a lot of my role is not so much choreographing, but just being on set to kind of uphold the continuity of these movements. So if one character needs to have their feet this wide apart, and I see them, it's the same as art direction. Like if a collar is in the wrong place or something, they have to run in and change that. But this is with posture, with gestures, and with stances. So that's on the more nuanced side of it. But then there's, entire. It's been pretty exciting kind of working with directors who are like, I don't want to see anything, here's a fight scene, I don't want to see anything I've ever seen before. Or here's a kill scene, and I don't want to see, I want all new kills. And so then I get to do a ton of research and kind of understand what hasn't been done, and begin workshopping with the actor and understanding the story to kind of develop something that would really resonate with that particular narrative. It's a completely different process. It's on a completely different timeline, and I really enjoyed the collaborative nature of it, because all of a sudden you have 50 different departments working together, and I'm not the one trying to forge ahead. I'm working on the set. Whereas in these productions, it's a lot of kind of convincing people to let me do things, or doing kind of carving out the space to make it happen. I'm not sure if that answers your question actually, but
Okay.
yeah.
It's kind of similar question, but you started as a ballet dancer in LA, and you dance in Spain.
Yeah.
How this transition from ballet world to artist happen, and then which department were you in BARD MFA?
In the film video.
Oh,
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
Yeah. How this transition?
Yeah. So yeah, I started in LA. I was at LA, Los Angeles Ballet, and then was dancing in San Francisco, and danced in New York. But then after I went to Barnard, studied culture anthropology, and there I was. All my friends were artists and filmmakers, and I kind of had this split life where I was going downtown to dance and train every morning, then all my classes were at night, and I just was working all the time. And I did my thesis on the the evolution of our corporeal vocabularies as we kind of undergo this influx of new technologies. So really looking at how interface design has given us a new vocabulary and continues to do so. And that's when I started the Gesture Archive project, because I wanted to just start capturing all of these movements that I was writing about. And so there was this, that element of it was also there was a lot of video involved, but I still had my worlds very separate. It was kind of my school and then the dance world, which I never really felt a part of fully. And I decided after Barnard to join a company and just kind of dedicate my time to that because I hadn't done that just solely. And went on tour doing Swan Lake in an international tour with Angel Correa's company in Madrid. And that was an incredible experience. But I also learned that a lot of being a dancer isn't necessarily being an artist. So I felt very, I was filling up notebooks of ideas, and it kind of was like, I don't have any time. You dance for 8 hours a day, you perform, and then you ice yourself and you go to bed and that's your life. And I didn't really have the drive to kind of go up the ring. I didn't really want to become a professional ballet dancer forever. I kind of wanted to do everything. So at the last performance of this 2-year tour, or maybe 3-year tour, I broke my foot on stage at the beginning of first act of Swan Lake and continued to dance through the whole piece, went back to New York and continued to dance for 6 months. I had no idea it was broken, and then got an MRI and they put me in a boot. And the second I was in a boot, I just had all this extra energy, and I feel like that was the moment that I started needing to choreograph. And it began by having friends who are artists asking me to kind of do something for their opening show or kind of create a piece in collaboration with them or create an event. So I really kind of owe it to that community for inviting me in to do that. And it's those first performances that I also really learned about how quickly the temperature goes up in a gallery when you have 8 dancers doing really rigorous choreography as opposed to something that's very, I guess, not as technically difficult. And how upset the curators would get when they were worried about the other artworks and just like how sweaty everything got. But so yeah, that was the transition into it, and I continued to dance, and the ballet kind of just transformed into being the introduction to my studio practice. So every morning I would go take class, and that was the place where kind of everything would kind of begin, the ideas. But I wasn't taking class in order to prepare for a performance anymore. And I decided to go to Bard because I had so much footage. I mean, I have like hundreds of hard drives of footage from Gesture Archive, and I'm a lot of my research process just involves me taking a lot of video of all these sites, and also not knowing how to deal with the documentation of these very long form performances that last for months. And I really wanted that to be a space where I could begin to kind of negotiate how to put those things together. And Charlie Atlas was the guest for the 3 years I was there in the film department. And he had worked so closely with Merce Cunningham and was kind of a hero of mine. So it was a pretty wonderful fit for me.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.